Hello everyone, in today's video I will teach you how you can build an MVVM application that displays the League of Legends characters. So this is how the application looks. We have the champion list and we can real-time search for them, for example Draven, and we can click and we can see some details like the tags that it has, the title, the lore. We can expand and collapse these. We have the passive and the abilities. And we also use the type-sim navigation. We are making API calls with Ktor, and we are also using dependency injection with Hilt. I also highly recommend you to get the repository from the description because it has a lot of dependencies and you can't add all of them from the video. You can simply copy and paste them in your project from the repository, or you can download the repository on your computer and code along with me. Now let's talk about the package structure. So the first package is the UI, in which we are holding the UI related data, for example screens, view models, and so on. The second package is the domain package, and this keeps the business logic, and the business logic means that it contains models, for example the data classes that we are using in the application, and we are retrieving them from the API. Repository interfaces that are like such a blueprint that is integrated in the data package by using repository implementations. This package is very useful because you can write tests based on it, because you have interfaces, and when you're testing, for example in unit or integration tests, you are creating fake repositories that are implementing the interfaces that you provide in your main application. The last package is the data package, and this holds all the data related logic such as network requests, databases, data store, repository implementations, and so on. Okay, so firstly let's start with the domain package, and let's create a new package, and this is called domain, and inside create another package called model. And the model basically will be the class that will be retrieved from the API call, and we can use that in our application. Now let's create one more package, and this is called repository. And inside we will have the repository interfaces. For example, we will have an interface for our API that will be implemented in the data package. So let's create another package called data, and inside let's create the repository package and one more package called DI, that stands for dependency injection. Dependency injection means you can create in one place an object or a dependency, because that's how it's called, and you can pass it through the app with one single instance. You do not need to create another instance of that object or dependency. Now let's collapse the data package, and we will start with the model package, but before that let's take a look at the API. Okay, so now we are on the API page, and as you can see we have this endpoint for champion, and we can also retrieve champions with this. But let's take a look, for example, for a single champion, and let's select pretty print. And as you can see we have data, and in the data we have the champion, and this also has the title, the name, skins, lore, and abilities. But as you can see, this JSON is quite bigger, and we will not take every parameter from this JSON. Now let's copy this one and let's jump into Android Studio. Before creating the model you need a plugin, because you can't by default create classes from JSON with Android Studio. You can use Gemini for that, but I prefer to use a plugin. So go to plugins and select marketplace and search for Kotlin to JSON, and I'm using this one. I can update it, but I won't do that right now. So JSON to Kotlin class, and rerun the Android Studio if it's necessary, and let's continue. You can right click here, new, and Kotlin data class file from JSON. Okay, so now let's see what we need to remove. So we can remove these parameters. Let's remove the sprite 2 and let's keep the group. Now we are removing the skins because the API doesn't provide us an image with them. Let's remove the ally tips, enemy tips, but let's keep the tags. Now let's remove the part type, info, stats, and keep spells. And let's edit spells. So we will keep only one object because it already creates a list of them and we want an object. So this JSON is quite complicated because if we are staying to edit every spell, it won't take an effect because we might forget a field and create one that we don't want. So let's see. We will keep the description, the tooltip, it's gone, level tip 2, and the effect. And let's remove this too. And okay, let's scroll down here and we will keep the ID, name, and description and the image. Let's remove these ones and the sprite. And let's also remove the resource. We need to scroll down until the passive is showing up. Let's remove this and close the parentheses and put a comma. In the passive, the same thing, remove the sprite, the X, Y, and stuff. And the best part is that if you get the repository from the description, you can simply copy paste these classes and you don't need to do the thing I'm doing. And remove the recommended and scroll down until the bottom because we don't need anything from this thing. And I think the JSON is good right now. So click format to be sure. I think it's okay. And the class name will be champion response. And this should have a model as a suffix, but with this plugin, I have some settings that will help us. So for the serialization, I'm using Kotlin X serialization. And as you can see, the keyword is vol, type is nullable because we can also retrieve some null data. Default strategy is init with non-null default value. Annotation is for the Kotlin X serialization. In the other, these are my settings, and in the extensions, I simply added the suffix appended. I added the suffix append after every class name model and click OK. This won't generate the class because I forgot to remove this one. And now let's click generate. Don't ask me again. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so as you can see, the champion response model got created, but this looks weird and we will fix that in a moment. And as you can see, the data model has an Atrox model because the API returned the class name as Atrox, but we need to make sure that we are removing this one. So this data model because it's not right. And rename this as champion. This is annotated with serial name because this is how the data is called in the API call. And as this is showed up, it doesn't matter that my variable is called champion. Remove this because we deleted it and create a map because, as I said, this can return instead of a single class a champion name. We can say string and a string of champion model. But this is called Atrox model. I will rename it in a second, but let's put an empty map for here. And let's go into Atrox model and let's rename this champion model and let's replace it here. Oh, okay, I already said champion model here. So I need to rename the file. So Shift F6 to rename the file and let's say champion model. And now let's go through the files. So this will be the response that we will retrieve from the API. The champion model is this one. We have the list of spell model, but this is not a null list because we can simply put an empty list. So empty list, and here too, empty list. So here is the passive model, and here we have the description, image, and the name. And let's go to the spell model, and this has the description, ID, image, and the name. With this all created, we can jump into the repository package from the domain and create a new file called API repository. And let's select interface, and here we will have two functions. The first one is suspend fun, get all champions. This will return an API response of champion response model. You may wonder what is this API response, and this API response comes from the Skydops sandwich, and this library, it is very useful because we can easily handle the success and the error cases that are coming from the API call. Okay, the next function will be suspend fun, get champion by name, and the name is a parameter of string and API response of champion response model. We can collapse the domain package and go to the data package, and inside we have the repository package, and here let's right click new, and here we will have the API repository implementation. This inherits from the API repository, and we need to implement the members, so implement them. Now we need to have an HTTP client because Ktor provides us an HTTP client that we can use to make the network requests. So in the constructor, let's say private vol HTTP client, and this will be passed to the API repository implementation when we are creating the object in the app module, which is related to dependency injection, but we will get to that soon. So let's complete this, and after that we will set up the dependency injection. So now we need to create a companion object, and the companion object can be accessed by simply writing the class name and let's say .base URL, and this is how our variable will be called. So let's say companion object, and let's say const val base URL, paste it here. I paste this URL here because when we are creating the HTTP client, this will be passed as the default URL to the API, and this can be easily accessed from the API repository implementation. And now let's implement the get all champions. So this is equal to HTTP client dot get API response, and this get API response is from the Skydops library, and let's put a parenthesis here, and inside we will pass the path, and this will be champion.json, and this will give us all the champions that the API has. And about the champion name, we can simply copy and put an equal here, paste it here, and this will have the champion name.json. Now the next step is to set up Dagger Hilt. So let's collapse the data package, and here on the MVVM course, click new and create a Kotlin class file, and this will be called MVVM app. And we need to inherit from the application, from the Android app. Now we need to annotate this with Hilt Android app, and this application needs to be added in the Android manifest.xml. So in the application, say main and the MVVM app. Now collapse this, and we need to go into the main activity and also annotate this with Android entry point. And this is how we can set up the Dagger Hilt, and this will enable us the dependency injection in the application. And the last step is to create the application module that holds all the dependencies. So in the DI package, create a new file, Kotlin class file, and this will be called app module, and this will be an object. Now we need to annotate this with two annotations. So this one will be module, and the second one is install in singleton component class, and this will enable us to create singleton instances of the classes. Now we need to create a function that will provide us the HTTP client that I talked about earlier. So let's create a fun provide HTTP client, and this returns an HTTP client. So let's put equals HTTP client. Now we need to pass an engine to this HTTP client, and we are using the OKHTTP.create, open the curly brackets. Now we can configure the HTTP client. So let's say default request, and in the default request, we are setting up the default API URL. So we don't need to pass it every time when we are making requests. So let's say URL and open the parentheses and simply say API repository implementation base URL. We can also add an additional header to be sure that the application will retrieve JSON files. So content type application JSON, but import the header. We don't need to write this down like that. We can simply say HTTP headers and let's say content type, and we are good to go. Now we need to also make this able to convert JSON data. So let's say installing content negotiation, open the curly brackets, JSON, and now we need to create a JSON object, and we can configure this JSON object by simply saying ignore unknown keys equals true. And as you saw earlier, I removed some fields from the data class, and with this field on, we won't get any errors from that. We need to do one more thing here, and this is the annotation. So we need to say provides in order to enable here to provide the HTTP client through this function. And we want a single instance through the whole app, and we annotate this with singleton. Now let's also create the repository. So let's say fun provide API repository, and let's return an API repository interface, and let's add an equals API repository implementation, and we need the HTTP client. So pass it here, HTTP client, and we need to also annotate it with provides and singleton. As you can see here, we return an API repository type, and API repository implementation inherits the API repository interface, so we can return it, and the HTTP client Dagger Hilt will inject it using this function straight into this provide API repository function. And now we are done with the data and the domain packages, and we can jump into the UI package. And here, let's create a new package called screen. And as you guessed, here we will keep the screens and the other composables. So let's create another package, and this will be called champion list. And here we will have a champion list screen, which is a file. Let's create the composable champion list screen. Here we will have a simple lazy column that will enumerate the champions. We have the champions card and a search bar that will help us to find some champions. So let's create the champion card, and let's go in the champion list package and click new package, and let's say composable, and inside we need to create the champion card. Now let's say comp, because it's a shortcut for composable, and let's say champion card. I will remove the modifier because I do not need it, and let's start with a row, and let's add some horizontal arrangement dot spaced by 10 dp. Let's also create a preview to see what I'm doing. So let's say prev from preview, and let's say champion card preview. Let's open the tab, and let's also get the MVVM course theme and pass the champion card here. Okay, now we need to display the character image. So let's say painter resource are drawable, and let's import the R class, and we have the Draven card, and content description is null. By the way, in Draven main. Now let's say content scale fill width modifier dot weight 0.3f. Let's also round the corners. So let's say clip rounded corners, rounded corner shape of 20 dp, and the height of 180 dp. Let's build and refresh. Okay, so this looks like that because we didn't add the second item in the row. So let's also show the system background, and let's create the text that stays beside it. So let's say column text, and we will put an template text for now to see how it will look. So let's say Draven, and let's also style this. So let's say style, material, theme, typography, title large, and the font weight is font weight dot bold. Now let's add the weight modifier to the columns. So let's say modifier dot weight and put 0.7f. And let's also add some vertical padding. So let's say 10 dp, and the text should move inside, as you can see. And now we will add the champion description. So let's say text, I will paste it here. And now let's say overflow. It's equal to text overflow ellipses, because this will add some dots at the end of the text, but this has too many lines. So let's say max lines of 3. Let's also make the text smaller. So let's say style, material, theme, typography, body, medium, and the line height will be 24 sp. I will let it with dummy data until we continue with the view model. So let's go into the champion list screen and let's remove this modifier. And let's create a column, and above the lazy column, so let's create a lazy column first, we will have a text field. So let's say text field, let's make it outlined text field, and let's say text, and I think it's called value, right? It's value. On value change, we also need a placeholder, and let's create the preview for this screen too. So let's say champion list preview, and let's make it private and annotate this with preview. Show background true. Let's get the MVVM course theme and pass the screen. Now let's open the panel, and now we can start doing our stuff. Let's make the column fill the whole screen. So fill max size, horizontal padding. So let's say horizontal 20 dp, import the dp, and let's collapse the imports. Now the placeholder will be a simple text that says search for champs. Let's also round its corners. So let's say rounded corner shape of 12 dp. Let's also make this fill the whole width. And now let's also apply some padding to it. So let's say padding vertical 20 dp. And the last thing is to add the leading icon. So this will be an icon. Image vector icons dot rounded search, and the content description is null. Now let's also wrap this up with a scaffold. So let's say inner padding, and get this and move the column inside, and also add the padding, inner padding. This inner padding is like if you have the enable edge to edge, as most of the application have, this will prevent your application to overflow the top bar and the navigation bar. Now in the lazy column, let's say vertical arrangement, and we want to add some space between items. So arrangement spaced by 16 dp, and import the arrangement. And now we can iterate, for example, with 5 champion cards. So let's say champion card, and this is how it will look. And now we can continue by creating the view model. So click on champion list, new Kotlin class file, and let's say champion list view model, and inherit from the view model. Now this needs to be annotated with hilt view model, otherwise hilt won't inject the required dependencies that your view model has. So let's say inject constructor, because we are injecting the dependencies in the constructor, and we need to get the repository, the API repository. So let's say API repository. Now we need to create a new class that will be our state class, because we will have the champions list and we will also keep the search text. So let's click on champion list and create a new Kotlin class file, a data class, and this will be called champion list state. And this will have the search text, which is a string, and by default it's an empty string, and the champions, which is an list of champion model, and this by default is an empty list. Now let's create the variable that will keep the state, and it will also update the UI when a change occurs. So let's say private vol underscore state and mutable state flow of the champion list state. Now we need a variable that the UI can listen to. So let's say vol state without the underscore state as state flow. And in the UI we can listen to this state. And now let's make a function that will update the search text. So let's say on search text change and get a new text, let's say string, and we can update this by simply saying state update it.copy, and in the search text we pass the new text. I forgot to add one more field because when the text changes we want to perform a query. So let's go to the champion list state and let's say filtered champions list champion model and empty list. And now let's say filtered champions, and we can simply say it.champions filter, and now we can get the champion, and we will filter them by the name. And let's say contains, let's check for null, and if it contains text, and let's also ignore case, so let's say true, and we need to say that it is equal to true. Let's go into the domain model champion response model, and now we need to create an extension function for the map. So let's say fun map of the type string and champion model to champion list, and this will return a list of champion model. This is equal to this, and now we can simply say values to list. Now we can get back to the view model, and now let's also fetch the champions. So let's say init, and now we need to say API repository get all champions, and as you can see this is a suspend function and needs to be launched in a coroutine scope. The view model already has one, so we can use it. So by saying view model scope dot launch and move the API call here, now we can say dot on success and we can retrieve the data. You can also say on error and on failure to handle the errors, but I won't do that here. It's your homework to do that, so I will continue with the on success case. So let's say state.update it.copy to update the state, and let's say champions is equal to data champion and to champion list. Now let's also update the champion card with the real champion class. So let's say champion model, and the parameter will be called champion. And we won't use an image here. We will use an async image because otherwise we won't be able to retrieve the image from the network. And for that, I will go in the API repository implementation. We also need different URLs for different images, so I will paste them here and you will have all of them in the base project. Now we need to pass the URL to get the image. So let's say API repository implementation, loading URL plus champion name underline 0 and JPEG. Now let's also replace the champion name. So let's say champion name, and by default, if it's null, we put an empty string, and let's also replace the description by saying champion dot lore. And if it's null, an empty string will be shown. And let's also go to the champion list screen, and let's add the state to the champion list screen. So let's say state champion list state, and let's replace this. So let's say state dot champions, and let's replace the items count with items that has a list, and this will give us a champion, and we can pass it here. So champion is equal to champion. Now let's also modify this. So let's say state dot search text, and let's also say on value change, and this returns an unit, and it has as a parameter a string, exactly like the on value change from the text field. So let's say on value change. And one more thing we need to do after we remove the preview is to not use the champions, it is to use the filtered champions, and if it's empty we display the whole list of champions. So now let's go into the main activity and let's retrieve the view model. So let's say ball view model is equal to hilt view model of type champion list view model, and let's create a screen. So champion list screen, and pass the state. We don't have the state, so we need to get that from the view model. So let's say state by view model dot state collect as state with lifecycle to be aware of the lifecycle changes, and let's paste it here. State is equal to state. Let's remove these curly brackets and pass the on value change from the view model. So view model on search change, and this is how we can pass the function without opening the curly brackets if it has the same parameters. Now let's run the app and see how it presents. Okay, so I got an error, and it is because I forgot to add the internet permission. And to do that, we need to go into the manifest and read manifest XML, and let's say use this permission internet, and let's rerun the application. I remember that we also need the blurb because this will show on the champion list. So blurb, and replace the name here too, blurb. And now let's replace this with champion.blurb, and if it's null, we put an empty string. Okay, so as you can see, we have the champion list, and let's, for example, search for Draven, and as you can see, we have Draven. And if you want to animate this list, you can add the modifier. So you can say champion card. Let's add a modifier to it. So let's say modifier, and let's apply this to the row. Modifier is equal to modifier, and we can get back to the champion list screen and pass the modifier animate item, and let's put this on separate lines, and let's rerun the app, and let's search for Draven, and as you can see, the other items disappeared with a slow animation. Now let's create champion details. So let's say champion details package, and inside let's create the champion details screen. Let's say comp champion details screen, and let's remove the modifier. Now let's start with the composables. So let's say composable, and the first one is the champion header. So let's say comp champion header, and let's make a preview to see what I'm doing. So let's say champ preview show background to true, and now let's say the MVVM course theme, the champion header, and let's create a list item, and this will have a headline content, supporting text, content, leading content, and trailing content. Pass the champion, so let's say champion model, and let's remove this from the parameter name, put a comma, and let's put this on a new line. Now in the headline content, we want to display the champion name, so let's say text, and let's say champion dot name. Now let's increase the font size to 20 sp, And let's make this text bold. So font weight dot bold. In the supporting content, we want to display the tag. So let's say text champion dot tags, and we want to get the first or null, and if it's a null string, we display empty. Now let's say async image model, and for that we will use the API repository implementation dot image square URL plus the champion dot name dot png. The content description is null. Let's also add a size. So let's say modifier size, for example, 30 dp. And in the trailing content, we will display the champion title. So let's say text is equal to champion.title, and if it's null, we put an empty string. Let's also make this bold, and let's say style, material, theme, typography, title, medium. And let's also apply the modifier. So let's say modifier is equal to modifier. Now let's create another composable called champion lore, and let's make the composable. Okay, this will have a parameter called lore, which is a string, and let's put this on separate lines. And now let's create a column, and let's say text, and let's say lore, and let's make this bigger. So let's say material, theme, typography, title, large. Let's also make this bold, so font weight bold, and apply some bottom padding. So padding bottom for dp. And now let's display the lore. So let's say text is equal to lore. Style is the material theme, typography, body medium, and let's say max lines 3 for now, because we will make this number increase when the text is expanded. When it overflows, we need to say ellipsis. Let's also say line height of 22 sp, and let's create the variable that will expand the lore. So let's say var is expanded by, remember, mutable state of false, because by default this won't be expanded. Now let's start with the column, and let's say modifier is equal to modifier dot clickable, and I'm using the parameter modifier and apply additional modifiers to it, like the clickable is expanded is equal to is not expanded to update the value. And now we can say if is expanded, we want the max lines to be int max value. Otherwise, we have only 3 lines. Also, to animate the expansion, we can use the modifier animate content size, and this will animate. And let's also have a text that says show more or show less. So let's say text if is expanded, we will display show less, otherwise we display show more. The font weight is bold. Let's also say style is equal to material theme, typography, body medium, and let's also apply some top padding. So let's say modifier padding top of 4 dp. And the last composable we need to create for this screen is the champion spell. And let's say champion spell here, and let's get the spell. So spell model. Now we will create a list item, and we will have a headline content, on leading content, and on supporting content. Let's start with the headline content. So this will be the ability name. So text is equal to spell name, otherwise an empty string. Now let's add the ability description. So let's say text spell description, and now we need to display the spell icon. Okay, so let's say async image and model. Now we need to say API repository implementation. I added the ability URL plus spell name PNG. Content description is null, and let's also add the content scale crop, and let's say modifier dot size of 32 dp. Let's import the dp, and let's also clip this shape and make the corner rounded. So let's say rounded corner shape of 8 dp, and this is not the spell name, it should be the spell id. Now we need to also create the champion passive composable, so let's copy this and we need to create a new composable, champion passive. Let's say paste it here, and let's save passive. Let's replace this with Shift F6 passive, and the type is passive model. Now we need to replace this URL with image passive URL, and let's remove the PNG from here and simply say passive image full and put the question mark here. So let's get the champion, and let's remove the model from the parameter name, and let's start with a scaffold with inner padding. And now we can create a lazy column, because if the content is too large we need a scrollable column, so that's why I'm using a lazy column. So let's say content padding, inner padding, and now let's create the item, and the first item will be the champion image. So let's say async image, and let's say model, and we need to get the API repository implementation, and we need the splash one plus the champion name 0 JPEG. Now let's say content description null. Now we need to say content scale dot fill width, modifier fill max width, and I will also add a height of 200 dp and import the dp. Now we can create the champion header, so champion header, pass the champion, and now we can add some padding. So let's say modifier dot padding, vertical 10 dp and horizontal 6 dp. I need to swap this because horizontally it's 10 dp and vertically it's 6 dp. Now let's continue with the champion lore. So champion lore and pass the lore. So let's say lore is equal to champion dot lore, and if it's null we return an empty string. Now I need to create a modifier. So let's say modifier dot padding, horizontal 20 dp and vertical 6 dp. Now let's display the passive. So let's say champion dot passive, and we are checking if it's not null, and otherwise if it's not null we display the passive. So let's say passive and pass it here. Now we need to add some padding. So let's say modifier padding, horizontal 6 dp and vertical of 10 dp. Now we need to display the spells. So let's say champion spells for each, and let's get the spell, and we can simply say champion spell, pass the spell, and the modifier will be the same as here, so paste it here. Now the screen is done and we can create the view model. So let's say new Kotlin class file champion details view model, and let's inherit from the view model. Let's also annotate this with health view model to be able to inject the dependencies. Let's inject in the constructor the API, so private vol API repository, and here we can simply have one variable champion, and this is a mutable state of on nullable champion model. So champion model, and make this nullable and pass null as a default value. And in the init block, we can say view model scope, launch, and let's get the API repository dot get champion by name. Now we need to get a champion name. So to do that, we need to create the navigation routes first, because we will use the saved state handle that will give us the argument from the route. So let's go into the UI and create a new package called util. And in this package, we need to create a new file that will keep our routes. So let's say this will be called routes. And now we need to create a data object that will be the champion list, and annotate this with serializable. And we need to create the data class. This will be champion details, and this will have our name as an argument. And this is also a serializable. And this will be the navigation routes, because we can pass them to the navigation controller. So let's get back to the champion details view model, and let's get the private vol saved state handle. And let's say args is equal to saved state handle to route, and pass the route that we created before, and this is champion details. And now we can simply say args.name, and we can say on success and update the champion. So champion.value is equal to data.champion.values first or null, and that's it. Now let's go into the main activity, and we need to implement the navigation to finish this project. And let's copy these ones and we will add them later. So let's say nav controller, because we need the navigation controller to navigate through the screens. Remember nav controller to create it. Now we need to create a navigation host. So let's say nav host, and we need to pass the nav controller and the start destination. And the start destination in our case will be the champion list. Open the curly brackets and let's create the first composable, and this is how we call a route. So let's say champion list, and let's say champion list screen. And I forgot that I have this on my copy paste, and I forgot to add the one parameter to this function, because we also need to navigate. So let's say navigate, and this will have a string, and that string will be the name. And let's say champion card, and we can add the modifier here. So let's say clickable, navigate, let's say champion dot name, and let's check for null first. So let's do that. Now we can go back in the main activity and add the navigate, and this will get the name. And let's say nav controller navigate, and we can pass the champion details route and pass the name. Now let's create the second route. This is the champion details. So let's say composable champion details. Now we can do the same thing. So let's copy the view model and paste it here, but we change the view model, of course, champion details view model. Now we need to check if the champion is not null. So let's say champion value and use the let. And now we can simply say champion detail screen, and let's run the app. Okay, so I forgot that I also need to add the champion prefix here. So let's search for Draven, and as you can see, we have the abilities, the passive, the lore, so we can expand and collapse it. We can also increase the size of this image by going into the champion header, and let me see the image. Let's make it 40 dp. Now it's better. So thank you for watching, and I hope this video helped you, and if so, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more content like this, and see you in the next video.